All right. So since we are not taking action today on this bill, we will go ahead and open it up and have a hearing. So to begin, I would say, Representative Earhart, would you mind open us up prayer? Oh, hold on. Which one are you? 23?
Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you so much for the opportunity to gather together today to go about the people's business. Lord, I pray that your hand will be on this meeting, that we will honor you in all that we do and say. Please bless this meeting to you, Lord, and just please bless those that are in need at this time, Father. We just pray that lift them up and pray, Lord, for a great meeting. In his name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. So today we're here to Senate Bill 146 by Majority Leader Gooch. Before we get moving too quickly, I would like to start off by saying to Senator Gooch how much I appreciated the time on the EV study committee with you. I know that you put a significant effort in over the summer to pull together some good, solid, sound legislation to move our infrastructure for the EV revolution to come, and to support fuel choice for Georgians. And I think that's a good thing. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chairman and committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you today about a bill that you should be familiar with by now. I think a companion bill already passed this committee, chaired by Chairman Jaspers. And so this bill is very similar. There's just a couple small changes to it, but SB 146, as passed by the Senate, was LC number 365549S. This bill is a first step, in my opinion, of what the future will bring more changes as we evolve into the electrification of transportation. We studied this topic over the summer and fall, as you mentioned earlier. And many of you were in those meetings and you traveled the state, and we heard a lot of details, a lot of data, a lot of statistics, and we heard from many experts, not only in the utility business, but in the automobile industry and transportation industry. And so we're at the forefront of a new movement in America, and I think Georgia is leading the way, along with a couple of other states. We seem to be out in front, as we have been on many other issues dealing with transportation. So what we want to do with this bill is to sort of set up a framework and a structure to get some basic parameters in place that will allow us to begin to implement these changes as the cars are more apparent on the roadway. There's only about less than 1% of the cars being sold today that are electric powered, but we believe that number is going to change rapidly, and so we're ready to move forward with this piece of legislation. And this bill only does three simple things. One, it allows for the electricity to be sold or be resold through the chargers by the kilowatt. Currently in state law, it's only sold by time on the charging stations. This bill allows for that sale of electricity by convenience stores, hotels, restaurants, whomever. So it'd be a commercial charging station. They would be able to sell the electricity by the kilowatt. It also sets up the accountability and the parameters for ensuring that the charging stations are being calibrated and measuring the energy correctly, just as we do on gasoline pumps and diesel pumps today at a convenience store. This bill will allow the Department of Agriculture to set up those regulations as well. And the third item in the bill deals with the capture of the equivalence of the motor fuel tax that we currently get off of the sale of gas and diesel. Once cars no longer buy motor fuel and begin buying electricity, we have to offset the loss of that revenue to the Department of Transportation. So that's the third portion of the bill. I'm happy to go through it section by section, but Section 1 deals with the Georgia Territorial Act. It basically establishes that we will be selling the electricity by the kilowatt. It also deals with an arrangement made by the PSC last year dealing with community charging programs, where the Georgia Power would be allowed to set up charging stations in unserved areas. And the agreement was that they would spend $9 million over a 3-year period, and they would be allowed to set up 11 charging stations per year in those unserved areas. That would be the only place they would be allowed to do that. If the Georgia Power decided to go outside of that charging program area, then they would have to set up a separate subsidiary, so there would not be as tendency to compete with the other charging stations that are owned by public commercial enterprises. So that's already agreed to in a rate case study last year by the PSC, but it pertains, that language is listed in Part 1, Section 1, starting on lines 25 and going through lines 55. If you go to Section 3 of the bill, Section 2.2 actually, that's where we begin talking about the accountability and the testing by the Agricultural Commissioner. That's on line 67, beginning there, and it goes through that entire section. These are just some of the same kinds of phrases that you'll see in the code section dealing with the gasoline pumps and the diesel pumps that the Commissioner of Agriculture has to set up and test the standards of those pumps. We define the residential charging station for a single-family dwelling and also for multifamily. And so the purpose of that is people who own a home or live in an apartment complex would be able to use home charging stations and not be subject to the taxation, because people who own the electric cars pay an annual fee of approximately $215 a year to operate that car on the roadway. So they would not be subject to the taxes on their residential meters. Portions of the bill on lines 104 through 110 were some changes that we made at the recommendation of all the charging partners that are in the room, and that deals with the standards that we would adopt, and that would be the national standards. So you'll see that language. It deals with National Institute for Standards and Technology. In the original bill, we did not identify NIST standards, but we made that change in committee in the Senate, and we added that, and it passed the Senate. So we'd like to ask you to keep that in the bill. On lines 119 and 120, you'll see a language dealing with digital networks. This was also an amendment that we added in committee. We call it the Tesla language. It allows for smartphones to be able to track the usage of the kilowatts. Some of the Tesla charging stations do not have meters on them, so the app would be utilized for that provision. So we put that in the bill as well. The rest of that section is just basic language dealing with the inspections and the permittings of the charging stations throughout the state. Again, that would be monitored by the Department of Agriculture and his commissioner and his appointees. The charging stations would be sealed. If anyone violated the seal and broke into the charging station, they would be charged with a misdemeanor, and they would be brought to court and fined accordingly. Part 3 of the bill, which is on page 11, starting on lines 248, deals with the tax language. It's just cleanup language, adding electricity where you would normally see motor fuel, diesel fuel, gasoline, and that type of energy. We had to go through various portions of the code section and add electricity as motor fuel. So we defined motor fuel as electricity as well as gasoline. On lines 309, we have a line there dealing with the Consumer Price Index. It says it shall no longer be used after July 1st, 2025. I believe you struck that line in your bill. We did not do that in ours, but I'm happy to entertain that if you want to make that amendment today in your committee. We'll be happy to talk about that more in detail if you'd like. And if you go to page 14 on lines 332 through 334, this is where we convert electricity and get the gallonage equivalent of gasoline and diesel. In other words, how many kilowatts of electricity does it take to produce the same amount of energy as a gallon of gas or diesel? And according to the standard that is being used, it's a National Bureau of Standards Handbook, it would require 9 kilowatt hours of electricity for 1 gallon of gasoline or 14 kilowatt hours for 1 gallon of diesel. And the reason that's in here is it's very important. We have to direct the Department of Revenue on how to convert the charge of what we normally would pay for gasoline tax, motor fuel tax. As you all recall, it was set back in 2015 at 26 cents per gallon. With the CPI index, it's up to almost 30 cents a gallon today. So you would take the electricity of gasoline, let's say it's 9 kilowatts of power for a gallon of gas, you would convert 30 cents into the kilowatt equivalents, and that's the amount that the Department of Revenue would have to collect on all the charging stations for every kilowatt that goes into a car. Is that clear? You understand that? The rest of line, section 3 is cleanup language, no substantial changes there. Section 3-4 is cleanup. And I believe that is all. On the last page on line 419, we do have an effective date of January 1st, 2025. So we don't want this act to go into effect until the permitting requirements are met. The Department of Agriculture has to get up to speed. The Department of Revenue has work to do. The equipment will have to be checked and calibrated and permitted. So we believe a year and a half to 2 years would be adequate for the Agricultural Commissioner to get his department up to speed on that. So that was the reason we chose that date. Mr. Chairman, that's a quick rundown of a bill you've already heard in your committee once. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, this time we'll open up any questions of the committee. Okay, we got several. Let's see. Do you have the name? What's that? Huh? I can't hear. Thank you. Okay, let's see. All right, we'll start off mic 1. Holcomb. Representative Holcomb, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Leader Gooch, for your hard work. Right now, there are companies, and forgive me if I missed this on the House version that came through, that provide charging for free.
Yes.
So would that be able to continue, and then whatever store, vendor, they would just pay the taxes, those would be run through them? Like, how would that work? Because there is an existing infrastructure in place right now.
So whoever owns the charging station would be responsible for collecting and submitting the taxes to the department. There would be there'd be no free lunch. The people who own a charging station at home would not be subject to the tax or a multifamily dwelling, but anyone that charges at a public charging station would be. And so the intent is to pass that cost to the consumer. So if you pull up in your electric car and you plug it in at a hotel or at a restaurant or at a public charging station, whether that's at a C-store or wherever, there would be a charge for the electricity because the store owner would pay for the cost of the electricity from the power provider. They would provide some markup for profit, and then the state tax would be applied to that. So the consumer would pay the entire cost at the pump, just like you do today when you pump gas.
I understand. My question, I think, is towards some of the incentives that some of the manufacturers are offering. For example, one manufacturer, it doesn't do it anymore, but it did offer free charging for life. Some manufacturers for new cars now are offering, say, 2 years of free charging, et cetera. So it sounds to me like the purchaser, if one were to purchase a new car, they could still get the free charging, but the vendor would have to pay the taxes, correct?
Someone would have to pay the tax portion, yes.
Okay. I think I understand. Thank you.
And let me just reiterate the purpose for that. The Department of Transportation utilizes this motor fuel revenue for the sole purpose of maintaining the roads and bridges. We're spending approximately $3 billion a year to do that. If forecasts come to be reality, in the next 30 to 50 years, there will be no more gasoline engines on the roadways. So we have to convert our way of paying for this work in another direction, whether that's charging per kilowatt or charge vehicle miles traveled or some other form of revenue generation as a user fee. And so the Department of Transportation is going to undergo a pilot project this summer using the RUC charge, road usage charge. And so there may be 1,000 people, for example, that are utilizing this pilot project for the next year or 2 years. And we'll collect data. We want to know more about the travel habits of an electric car owner. How many miles per year does one travel? Some people say they only travel 3,000 to 5,000 miles a year. Some people say 10,000 miles per year. It varies depending on your personal needs. I will say that the commercial drivers like Amazon and FedEx, UPS, once those fleets become more available, you could see 40, 50, 60,000 miles per year being driven by those vehicles. And so a flat fee for everyone doesn't seem fair. It needs to be a variable fee, and that would be some kind of a usage fee like we're doing with this bill. Or eventually we may get to a road usage charge where everyone pays based on the number of miles traveled. But until we get that technology more readily available, this seems to be the approach that every other state is going to take in the short term.
Thank you, Representative Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leader, you put an awful lot of work and thought into this, obviously. As I understand that the tax side of things, that you come up with an equivalent that matches a gallon of gas.
Correct.
In short. And the language says shall not be more than. Does somebody set an actual amount, or you just assume that probably goes to the maximum there?
That'll be determined by the Department of Revenue.
DOR does
Yes,
that?
that's
Okay.
that is their job.
Thank you, Mr. Leader.
And I believe that's already in code.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Leader Gooch,
Yes.
for the bill. I know the House companion of this bill passed unanimously, and just reviewing it, there seemed to be at least two significant changes in the Senate bill that I wanted to go over with. But before that, procedurally, where do we go from here? Will this end up in conference committee, and will the differences be negotiated between you and Chairman Jaspers?
Well, ideally, the House would pass my bill without changing it, and then we would just be happy. Everybody would go to the governor's office, and we'd have a bill signing ceremony, and
Right.
everything would go great. No, I'm working closely with Chairman Jaspers, and I believe the language is close enough that he's already agreed that these changes are necessary. The different industry folks that are in the room have worked together. They've done most of the hard work getting to this point. I'm just delivering the message on their behalf as well as our behalf. And so I believe everyone has come together holding hands and singing Kumbaya. So if you don't have heartburn with something that we're doing in this bill, then I believe it will be an easy passage through the House and back to the Senate for an agree.
Thank you, Leader Gooch. No heartburn, certainly.
Good.
I think it's an exciting step in the right direction for our state. But if I may, just to go through the two differences that seem somewhat significant from the House version versus the Senate version, the definition of residence. In House Bill 406, it's a very short definition, whereas in the Senate version it seems much more comprehensive. Does the Senate version, would that essentially include apartment complexes, whereas the House version does not?
That's correct. And so we believe that a lot of car owners, electric car owners, will live in apartment buildings and multifamily units. And most of the time, the developers will put in charging stations in these small communities. And so we believe it's only fair to treat them as you would a single-family residence. And let me also add that the language that you see here, talking about the person living in a dwelling for longer than 30 consecutive days, is language that we used in prior legislation in House Bill 170, where we had the $5 per day fees. We use that similar language. So what we're trying to do is not allow people who are in and out, like Airbnbs and short-term rentals, to be able to get the free ride, for lack of a better word, but people who are permanent residents which live in a home for 30 days or longer. That's how we defined it.
Thank you. And two more questions, if I may.
Sure.
So going to Chairman Blackman's question regarding the rate on lines 332 to 334, it does seem somewhat or fairly different from the House version. I know the House version in House Bill 406 says that electricity shall not be less than 33.7 kilowatts. Here, electricity shall be not more than 9 kilowatt for gasoline. I assume that will be worked out, or that your version is the one that will stand?
Well, I don't want to put words in Chairman Jasper's mouth, but if he were here, I think he would tell you that he agrees with this language today.
Okay.
Because his language was put in there previous to mine. My bill was drafted after his, and I think the Department of Revenue feels comfortable with this language. And I believe he will agree with you when you talk to him.
On the House side, it also includes hydrogen, which isn't included in the Senate version.
Correct. Yeah, we don't see a lot of hydrogen fueled vehicles out there yet, but we hope that someday we will.
Okay, thank you, Leader Gooch.
Yes, sir.
Final question. Again, I'm very excited about the movement that our state's going through, and certainly in wanting to ensure that Chairman Jasper's concern of that our transportation fund is fully funded. If it does seem as if the gas tax or the tax on electricity is sufficient, do you see us potentially repealing the annual fee, the $217 fee for electric vehicles, as an additional incentive to facilitate that
Sure.
transition?
I believe the best way to do that, and I hope that ultimately we will get to that point, is if everyone who drives an electric car pays a road usage charge. So that would be so many pennies per mile driven. That way it doesn't matter where you charge your car or truck. It doesn't matter if you're using it for commercial usage or personal use. If you only drive it on weekends or if you drive it 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, you would only pay for the time you're on the road. And that's truly the fairest way to pay for government services. The people who use the service should be paying for it. So,
Thank you,
but
Leader.
I believe that would be easy to repeal in the future.
Yes, sir.
All right, we're going to do Chairman Parsons.
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Gooch, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Don.
I wanted to ask you about lines 47 through 51, which makes a reference back to line 26. And it would appear that there's going to be some, it has a requirement in here for the electricity sold for charging by Georgia Power to be through a separate legal entity, not subject to the authority and regulation of the commission, but there are exceptions to it. What are those exceptions, or why would there be those exceptions?
So this goes back to the earlier comment I made about the rate case when the PSC approved the community charging program. The Georgia Power and the PSC agreed they would spend, I believe it's $9 million for a 3-year period, and that would allow Georgia Power to implement 11 charging stations per year in unserved areas. And the way they defined unserved areas in their agreement was they would be only eligible in Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties. So if you're familiar with the Department of Community Affairs tier system, they have 4 tiers. You have Tier 1, 2, 3, and 4 counties based on wealth. And so if you look at an example, Forsyth County is a Tier 4 county. Nowhere in Forsyth County would Georgia Power be allowed to put a charging station under that provision in that agreement by the PSC. If they chose to put charging stations in Forsyth County, they would have to do it through a separate entity. The closest thing I can compare that to is if you recall when we did the broadband language for SB 2, we allowed the EMCs to get in the broadband business, but they would have to prevent cross-subsidization. So this is similar to the cross-subsidization language to where the EMCs were not subsidizing their broadband business. This would be similar language if Georgia Power were to sell electricity in a charger in Forsyth County, in a Tier 4 county. They would have to do it as a separate entity, and there would not be any commingling of funds. Does that make sense?
It does to a certain extent. I appreciate that. I guess I'm just still trying to figure out, not this, well, I do have one more question after that.
Let me add one more thing, if you don't mind. This is not language that was asked to be put in by Georgia Power. This language was added at the request of the other providers and charging station providers around the state. And there was a coalition of those individuals, and they're all represented in the room. And if we have time for public comment, one or two of those individuals may want to come up and make comment about that if you feel compelled to ask for that. So
Yeah,
that was not a Georgia Power amendment.
Well, I would imagine it was not necessarily something these other people asked for, but something they were able to negotiate for.
They negotiated, all the parties agreed to this language as it's written.
I'm just still trying to figure out why Mrs. Towery, who's 94 years old and lives up the street from me, has to pay for a charging station that goes in someplace in the state that she'll never drive an electric vehicle. In fact, she probably will never drive another gasoline-powered vehicle in her life, but she's paying for a power station, for a charging station that doesn't have to be under the separate subsidiary. I was having a hard time understanding why she has to do that.
I believe the number of 11 chargers per year is a very small number. And it'll only be in Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties, which are your poorest counties in Georgia, which I guess you could say the same thing about paying school tax if you don't have kids in school. You know what I'm saying? People get upset about that as well. But I hear what you're saying, Chairman. But this was an agreement that the parties agreed to per the order of the PSC. And so, and all the other charging partners in the room agreed to this language as well. So
I didn't agree to it. But
I understand, and you may not be completely happy with it,
Yeah.
but I think it's a deal that was made and that everyone can live with.
I certainly didn't. One more question, if I may. The next paragraph, 52 through 55, references subsection C. Now, is this the subparagraph above that, or where is this
Yes,
subsection?
sir, and it's dealing with their terms and rates and conditions of their charging stations. And so that's the similar language that we had in all the broadband discussions we had back 2 or 3 years ago.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Wouldn't you agree that this is actually different, though, from broadband? These are customers, these are subscribers to electricity. It's a public utility that's regulated, as opposed to the broadband that is not regulated. Would you agree with that? And I'm not going to sit here and argue with you.
Personally, I wouldn't want to put this restriction on Georgia Power at all, but the fact that they agreed to it says a lot about their intentions aren't to get into the charging station business. Their intentions are to continue to sell power to customers who will charge people to charge their cars. So if you ask them, they'll tell you they're not in the business of reselling electricity for cars that are driving up
They
the
have
road.
told us that many, many times,
Yes,
but
sir.
they continue to do it.
Only 11 charging stations per year for the next 3 years would be allowed. It's a very insignificant number. in my opinion.
All right.
Thank you, I appreciate
Yes,
it.
sir.
All right, last question, number 18, Representative Tran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Leader. This is a great short term, but there's still some things that are unclear. So I've got a few questions in regards to this. The first is there are parking garages and convenience stores where they just say pay $5, bring your own charger, plug it in, you leave when you leave. There's no metering involved. How would this bill affect them at all, or would it be business as usual for them?
It will affect them, and here's how. They'll, in the future, beginning in 2025, they will need to get a permit from the Department of Agriculture, just like a person who owns a gas station has to get a permit for the gas pumps. And the Department of Ag will send an inspector out, and they'll check to make sure the equipment is installed properly. They'll check and verify that the electricity is being charged properly. So, in other words, a gas pump measures a gallon of gas. The
Right.
same thing, there will be a machine purchased by the Department of Ag that will check the accuracy and calibrate that meter to make sure when they sell a kilowatt of power, then that's what you're actually getting and what you're actually paying for.
I don't think you understand my question, because they're essentially saying bring your own charger, which is the charger that comes with your car,
Right.
and plug it into a 110 outlet to charge.
At home.
No, at the convenience store or at the parking garage.
There
So
may
you're
be-
providing your own charger. They're not providing a charger. They're just providing a 110 outlet.
I'm not aware of a 110 outlet charging these electric cars.
The chargers that come with the cars are 110. That's why they're, right, you don't have to buy a charging station for your home.
This bill probably will not affect that at all, because there's no way to ever know who's plugging a 20 amp plug into a home and running it out to their car in the driveway. We'll never be able to do that. Furthermore, it's not going to address residential chargers. You'll continue to be able to put any level of charger you want in your home or your garage without the permit, without the tax, and without all the regulations that come with it. These regulations will only apply to non-residential customers.
Right. So airports, especially the airport parking garage and the parking lots.
Yes.
They literally just have 110 outlets, and they say, if you bring your charger, we're going to charge you $5. You plug in. When you come back, you unplug it, you're on your way. But I'm going to move on to my
If you go down to Buc-ee's, you'll see a super fast charger that'll charge your car in 20 minutes, and it takes a 50 or 60 amp service to charge that car versus your 110
Right.
example that would take 12 hours.
Yeah.
And Representative Tran, just so you know, all of the people that currently live in the state that have electric car have a tag fee that they pay associated with that goes directly.
right.
So those people that you're talking about, if they're pulling off to the gas station and plugging in, but they're a Georgia resident and they're plugging here in Georgia, they've already paid their taxes. So maybe that'll answer your question. But I'll allow one for one more, and then after that, we're going to get on with public comment.
Okay, the second one would be solar charging stands.
Did you say solar?
Yeah, again, not metered. The electricity is provided by the solar panels. Would you guys be certifying that as well?
You know, we haven't addressed the solar element in that. We haven't seen that yet. At least I haven't. But the way I look at it is if you drive on a public road, you have